Very good. Thank you. Anna Johnson is the North American Senior Programs Manager for the Laudato Si Movement. They mobilize passionate and talented Catholics across the continent for personal and systemic ecological transformation. Prior to joining the Laudato Si movement, Anna worked for about 7.5 years with us, with our church engagement division, was a leader of our program up in the great Pacific Northwest and the Seattle Mission House, focusing on missionary discipleship, Catholic social teaching, global solidarity, curriculum design, leadership training, particularly with youth and young adults. Anna was instrumental in developing our young adult empowerment programs. Anna has also served overseas as a lay missionary in Uganda with the Holy Cross Missioners. In her global work, she continued to witness how the climate crisis exacerbates all injustice, which drove her focus toward ecological justice. Anna has a Bachelor's of Arts in Peace Studies and Political Science from the University of Notre Dame, Go Irish, and an Executive Master's degree in Sustainability Leadership from Arizona State University. Anna also has a 1.5-year-old daughter who inspires her with great joy and an additional sense of purpose-filled urgency in responding to the ecological crisis. Anna not only works for the environment, but she loves spending time in God's creation, hiking, camping, kayaking, all types of outdoor activities. So we are very blessed to have Anna with us. And without any more of my conversation, I turn it over to you, Anna. Thank you again for helping us.
It is such an honor to be here and just so exciting as I see so many familiar faces. It just brings such joy to my heart. So thank you all for joining. It's just so good to see you. As Paul mentioned, I'm going to open us in prayer. And for those of you who have been paying attention to the news these days, your heart might be similar to mine, breaking constantly with the impacts of the ecological crises and the death tolls in the thousands from just events all around the world. So what we invite, what I know Maryknoll and so much of our spirituality and our faith invites us to do is to enter into this place holistically with our whole body. And so I invite you to start by imagining yourself in your favorite place in creation. Or if you're like me and you have 10, just pick one of your favorite places in creation. And imagining yourself there, think silently to yourself, what can you see? What can you hear? What can you smell? What can you feel under your feet or on your skin? What can you taste? What does the earth have to offer you in that place? What gift does creation offer you? I invite you to put your answer to that in the chat box. I'm seeing a lot of peace, place of refuge, wisdom, awe, serenity. They're coming in really fast. Praise be to you, my Lord, through our sister, Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, and who produces various fruit with colored flowers and herbs. God of grace and abundance, all of creation calls out to you, ourselves included. Creation calls out to you in praise through sunshine and laughter, frog croaks and mountain vistas. We come to know your love through the crackling of the fire and the sand between our toes. When we become witness to this praise, we are lifted alongside you in joy as part of your creation. Yet we know creation also calls out to you in pain, in crashes and groans, the silencing of song, and the cacophony of disastrous noise. We come to know your call to action through the urgency of waves and the desolation of dried earth. When we become witness to this pain, we better understand our role as a part of your creation. Trees in the forest grow roots deep and wide, intertwining with each other in mutual relationship. Help us to do the same. As our hearts are moved in awe, may we join in proclaiming your praise. And as our hearts are moved in compassion, may we be spurred into prophetic action with all the earth. Deeply rooted in this relationship with you and all of creation, help us to move forward with courage, knowing that with you, injustice is not invincible. Amen. All right, so rooting ourselves in the beauty and the peace and the reverence that creation has to offer, we're going to dive into a bit of the heaviness of what's happening in creation right now. But first, a story. I remember in my early days of working at Maryknoll, one of the Maryknoll sisters said to me, everyone who's done mission has a certain time come when they have a moment and they look at themselves and they say, how the heck did I get to this situation? Why am I here? What's happening? So I want to tell you a little bit about mine. When I lived in Uganda, as Paul mentioned, I was a missionary in Uganda. I was working with a local NGO in an internally displaced persons camp, filled with people who had been displaced by the war in the north of the country. This camp was filled with children and women who took children from their neighborhood when violence ripped through, leaving seemingly endless numbers of orphans, and child-headed households where a child of 12 would gather his siblings and cousins and neighbor kids after their parents died to head south towards safety. So all this to say, this camp was chock full of children running around. So we did some community surveying to identify the highest priority needs of the community, and one issue kept rising to the surface: children. They had no safe place to go during the day and losing valuable years of learning and healing and growing. So we worked together to create what's called a child-friendly space. The local diocese donated a building and some land on the edge of their camp, and we started getting to work. We dutifully, very carefully registered 60 students for the first day of school, which felt like a lot of students to start, but class sizes are pretty big in Uganda. The first day of school, I show up dressed all nicely, with my lesson plan all great organized and ready to go, to find 225 students running wild throughout this giant single room of the school building, which is made of concrete. And so you can imagine it wasn't like a quiet situation. This moment, I thought to myself, how the heck did I get here? Their mothers, their grandmothers, their caregivers and aunts had brought them to the space early, thinking that perhaps we wouldn't know who had been registered and that they could just have their child entered into this safe place where they could learn and heal and grow, because that's what every mother or caregiver wants for their child. So we realized in that we had certainly hit on a need. And so as we worked to make this a sustainable space, we tried to figure out how we could have a source of income. And so these pictures over here are from the child-friendly space. And the source of income that we thought, well, this will be great, pretty dependable. Most of the people in this camp know how to do it, is farming, right? So we developed this patch of land. We worked on planting and getting everything all in order so that we could farm, with some of the food going to the children, some of the food going to sale. And perhaps some of you who have spent time in mission might know this story. The rains didn't come when they were supposed to. And the sun was so hot and it dried up all the seeds and they died. And so now we're sitting here thinking, this is our plan. What are we going to do? So we like moved some grant money around, we bought a whole bunch of more seeds, and we planted again. And what happened this time? The rains fell so torrentially that it washed away all the topsoil, taking the seeds with it. So, as you might imagine, we're a little bit brokenhearted at this point. And I don't think that I knew how to name it, that it was the climate crisis, but we were beginning to see what was the impacts of the climate crisis happening on those who were most vulnerable already. And in my time at Maryknoll, I continued to see this as we went into different immersion places. So this is a statue that's in Guatemala, and this used to be one of the most fertile areas of the country, where there's stories that, you could just drop seeds and up would grow like giant tomatoes and plants and things like that. And now it's the home of the immigrant statue. They say it's the place of the migrant, because so many people have left because there's no place to continue to nourish. Now, I know that there's a number of you on this webinar who have been in places of mission, and I'm very curious to know, how have you seen the ecological crisis impacting the mission work that you're doing? I will do a brief overview of what is happening, right? Because maybe you hear about the climate crisis, maybe you hear about global warming, and you're like, what is this? Now everyone's calling it climate change. You hear about greenhouse gas emissions. There's like a bunch of numbers being thrown around, 350 parts per million. What does this mean? So here's a basic overview, and very basic. So please know that it has been, people get their PhDs in this and still don't understand it. So it's, I know a lot of you probably know more than even this is on as well. So the sun emits radiation in all directions. And this is due to the greenhouse gas thing, is the reason that we have a livable planet. Because we have this atmosphere, it holds in some of the heat from the sun as it throws it out towards us. And what has happened over the history of our Earth is that some of this energy and heat comes in and hits our Earth and then bounces off. And then other heat comes back into the Earth, and that's what keeps us warm. So hopefully you're with me so far. So this is like, we're not on some planet that doesn't have this atmosphere that just lets the cold go out automatically. This helps keep the heat in so that we have a livable planet where plants can grow, things like that. However, what's happening with greenhouse gas emissions is that as we burn these different fossil fuels and other chemicals, it is thickening this blue line, or what some people say is it's like creating a thicker blanket, so that more and more of the heat as it comes in is getting trapped inside of our atmosphere. So this is what's warming up our planet in the sense of global warming or climate change. Global warming became a little bit confusing of a phrase because sometimes it means that we have colder winters, and people were like, well, that doesn't make sense, because it's this complex scientific piece, but which is part of the reason that we changed our language to talk about climate change instead. So the use and burning of fossil fuels, which is oil that comes out of the earth, which is then refined into gas, which has been the primary source of energy consumption for almost everything we have. The energy to build materials of the buildings we live in and go to school in, the manufacturing of plastic bags and toothbrushes and glasses and binders, and the chip bags that you buy, and the car you drive, sports equipment, bags, building materials, all these things, right? When these fossil fuels are burned, that releases these particulates and makes this blanket thicker. Now, this information was discovered in, I'm curious if anyone knows. Do you know how long ago do you think that this was known about? 1856. It was discovered in 1856 that carbon dioxide would heat the atmosphere, done by research done by the scientist Eunice Foote. Then some of the first people who were diving into this science and math from a modern context were people working for fossil fuel companies trying to figure out their risk assessments. So fossil fuel companies have known about this for decades and decades. So fossil fuels, as perhaps you're hearing about these new big drilling projects and things that are coming across, this is the amount of fossil fuels remaining on this earth that we know about, which we can extract and burn. This is an exhaustible source, so there is an end to it. So this is about what we know of already. However, this is our remaining carbon budget, the maximum quantity of fuel that we can burn if we want to remain within 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, which is the UN agreed upon goal, but also which is based on the fact that this is what scientists are telling us that we need to remain below if we want to have a planet that can still allow for life similar to what it ever has been. To burn this amount only, we need to not fund any new fossil fuel projects. Now, perhaps you're looking at me and you're like, wait, I've been hearing about 2 degrees this summer. What's going on? Because of the way that the El Nino and some of the ways of the atmosphere has been moving, we have experienced a summer that is as if we have had 2 degrees Celsius of warming in certain moments. We've had the hottest summer in the history of recorded measurements. And so we're starting to see what some of the impacts of going above 1.5 degrees are with these intensive floodings, these firestorms, the tropical storms that are headed towards the Northeast right now as we speak, all sorts of things like that. So we're starting to feel how urgent it really needs to be here in the United States, whereas some of these things coming in from the chat too are showing us that people who are in some of the most vulnerable spaces in the world have been experiencing this for a much longer time. Scientific reports tells us that we must act urgently and quickly as we move this. So climate activists and scientists came together to get this clock installed in New York City. And any of you who are in New York, have you seen this clock by chance? Maybe you thought it was like a stock ticker. This is a countdown to our carbon budget time. This is the time we have remaining, the amount of time we have to get our global emissions to zero based on our current fossil fuel usage. This was taken a long time ago. I took this picture about 50 minutes ago. So our fossil fuel usage remaining, if we continue to burn it at the ways that we are, to stay within 1.5 degrees, we have 5 years, 310 days, and now about 20 hours. As Paul said, as I started, I have a 1.5-year-old daughter. So this gets her to about 7 by the time that we are 6, 7, by the time that we are burning through this if we don't change. Now, again, we can extend this if we slow down the burning of fossil fuels that we are moving on. So this is starting to tell us a little bit more about why people are so urgent about this crisis. If we don't meet this timeline, then we pass the 1.5 degrees of agreed upon safe warming, with every minute beyond that moving us into increasingly dangerous territory. All right, I invite everyone to take a deep breath because this is stark information. The great news is that we already have the technology that we need to make this happen. We have had huge advancements in renewable energy generation, wind, solar, thermal, that have not only increased their functionality, but also decreased the cost of implementation to make it feasible for countries to do this. We have incredibly passionate people, many of whom are on this call, across the economic spectrum, committing to living simply, stepping out of the race of consumerism and endless growth and profit. And we have the knowledge of how we're called to do that. We have incredibly creative people coming up with carbon zero things we need for everyday life, which I know we can buy from everything from toilet bowl cleaner to toothbrushes to how we move ourselves around in automobiles. And so you'd think, okay, great. The science has told us the truth. We have the solutions and the timeline that we need to finalize implementing that. Fossil fuel company leaders know this reality. Governments around the world, including the US, have agreed upon this shared goal to solve the biggest and scariest challenge of our time. So what's the big problem? The problem is that we're not solving it. Instead of reducing the burning of fossil fuels, we're using more and more every year. Oh, sorry, I forgot to advance slides. This is me saying that we have the solutions that we need. So we cannot invest in any new fossil fuel supply sources if we want to reach this net zero pathway, and we don't need to in order to get the world the energy that it actually needs. This has been scientifically proven. Yet these fossil fuel companies continue to launch new projects to drill for more oil extraction. The US government is signing off on massive drilling projects like the Willow Project in Alaska. The upcoming climate negotiation conference is, does anyone know where it's being hosted? Dubai, thanks Adam. And the president of this climate negotiation conference, the person that they named to oversee all of the negotiations of all of these governmental leaders who are coming together to say, what are our climate commitments, is in fact the CEO of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. Now, if that doesn't scream alert, alert to you, perhaps we're not paying attention. Now, this is a great slide that's used in the missionary discipleship formation program that Maryknoll runs. And this is the moment where we start to think, okay, I'm feeling a little helpless, a little hopeless, a little frustrated. Frustrated being like the nicest way of saying that word. Enraged might be a little bit more correct. And what is my source of hope? What am I called to do in this time? Now, when we look to just after the death and resurrection of Christ to the time of the early disciples, right? What was the time that they were living in? They were living in a time of intense fear, suspicion, revenge, violence, a time when the government and their version of companies and businesses were perpetuating this culture of not a very safe place to be, which feels a little bit like our current culture and our current space of being, at least to me. I don't know if it does to you as well. When I think about the climate crisis, I am fearful. I am suspicious of what certain companies may be doing. There are people out there who are seeking revenge in many ways, and it feels like there's extensive violence happening. But in this early time of the early disciples, in a time of fear, the early disciples were hopeful. When it was so suspicious, they were abundant and generous. In this time of revenge, they modeled forgiveness. And in a time of violence, they were peaceful. So we have this in our history. And I will also name that if you read the Acts of the Apostles, it's not like they were pushovers, right? Like we're not asking people to be this idea of peaceful, of being a pushover and being like, well, it looks like this is just what's happening. No, we're showing up with abundant, courageous love, but what that love looks like and how we carry it out. And so what's happening now in our church in a more current reality, you might be asking me? Well, one of my favorite people out there, Pope Francis, great guy. Hopefully you've heard of him. He did this video. He did a movie a while ago. I bet a bunch of you saw it. It was called A Man of His Word. And in this movie, he says this phrase: if today you ask me, for you, who is the poorest of the poorest of the poor, I would say Mother Earth. We have plundered her. So Pope Francis recognizes this issue. And for those of you who are perhaps, masters in theology or have other backing in Catholic social teaching, you might notice the very intentional way that Pope Francis switched the question that was asked of him and phrased his response in a very, very intentional way, which is brilliant. So in our history of Catholic social teaching, one of the tenets of Catholic social teaching is called preferential option for the poor and vulnerable. Who's heard of that? You can raise your hand if you've heard of that one. It's a good one. Yep. And what does that tenet teach us? That tenet says that anytime that we are at a decision-making table, anytime that we are making a decision about something that's impacting anybody, we need to have those who are most impacted to have a seat at that table. They need to have a voice in the conversation about the decisions that we are making. So, to go back to Pope Francis, if he's taking this question that he says, like, that wasn't very focused in Catholic social teaching, and he very explicitly used the phraseology that centers it right into this tenet of preferential option for the poor, he is saying that there needs to be a seat at every decision-making table for the earth. As we make our decisions about how we spend our money, how we advocate, who we vote for, where we're moving in the world, what we're doing, we should have a seat at the table for the earth to have a voice. So, in case you're wondering if the church has anything to say about caring for our common home, certainly does. We certainly do. So our faith is calling us forward into this crisis, right? So many Maryknollers will say, if we're comfortable, we're not doing God's mission right. And so if I'm called to be showing up in places of discomfort, it means that I'm supposed to be living this out, that I'm called to step into this fray with courage, with love, with abundance and generosity, but with this fortitude of saying, we are making sure that the voice of creation is present at these tables. And there's a beautiful picture of Earth. So if we are taking into account the voice of the earth, as well as the voices of those who are most impacted, who are also a part of the earth, right, by what is going on, those who are poorest, who are most impacted by the effects of climate change, then what are we called to do? We are called to let justice and peace flow. So this is the theme of this year's season of creation. The season of creation is a season that moves, it's an ecumenical season for all Christians to celebrate that starts on September 1st and goes until October 4th. Now, October 4th is a great feast day of, if you know the feast day of whose feast day that is, drop it into the chat. Or if you know by chance what September 1st is. Eliana, yes, the feast of St. Francis. Thanks, Mary. You're all great. You know this. So it goes until the feast of St. Francis. So it's a period of time when we're called to celebrate and rejoice in creation and also act in a particular way for and with creation. And how do we do that? Well, we're each called to take our own actions. And in Laudato Si, Pope Francis talks about differentiated responsibilities. In this section, he talks about what am I called to do based on my context, my socio-political context, where I'm a citizen, what rights I have, what abilities I have, what access I have to decision-making tables, where I can really make a difference. And so one of the ways we can do this is through making changes in our own places and spaces. And so Paul sent me this picture of the Pachamama farm on the campus at Maryknoll, which is that beautiful farm that is really about taking time to put our hands into creation and get our hands dirty and be rejoicing in it. And also this great picture of a real stewardship of space that Maryknoll installed these solar panels above the parking lot, which I remember the staff members being like, this is great because it means I don't have to shovel the snow off my car. And it also does the great job of energy generation from where we move. So we can renewable energy sources. We can think about how we use our own spaces and places to be most responsive to this crisis. We also can, there's sort of three ways that we can do this. So one is through our own personal or community engagement way, such as these two. Another way is through defunding the fossil fuel industry. So if we look at who is most culpable for this crisis that we are in, we can say this is the fossil fuel industry is driving this in so many ways. And this can be done through things like divestment, which has been this movement of the church and of many faith organizations to divest their finances and their investments from the fossil fuel industry, saying that if we are, in fact, people trying to live out our faith and live out life, a culture of life, then we cannot be investing in that which is creating destruction. And then the third one, which has instilled and inspired our call to action for this season of creation, is through governmental action and governmental advocacy. So collectively with these organizations, we've created this call for climate justice during this season of creation. And what are we asking you to do? So in this, we invite you to organize a prayer service in an ecologically impacted place. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, Anna, what do you mean an ecologically impacted place? You're probably right, because I could drive to a burned out forest out here in Washington state that a forest fire swept through, which has been impacted by the ecological crisis through the increasing temperatures, a whole host of scientific reasons that was more likely for the extremity of the wildfire due to the climate crisis. But I also could walk into my backyard and point at the tomatoes that, I'm not the greatest green thumb, but like worked so hard for tomatoes, and what happened? They died because we had like an extreme heat that came through. So you could do this really anywhere, right? You could go into the very visible place, or you could do it in your neighborhood, talking about some of the extreme heat or other places that you lived through. Then what we ask people to do, discerning and trying to listen to the voice of those most impacted, is to take sort of the 2 feet of love in action. So one step is through this thing called the forgiveness of debt letter, which is inspiring and asking the US government to add to the agenda of the COP, forgiving the debt that the global South owes towards the global North. There have been studies coming out recently that show that the money that the global South owes to the global North is creating situations where they have to invest in fossil fuel projects in order to try and pay it off, because it's the quickest sort of return on investment at this point. So this is an essential need to help them meet their urgent and immediate needs in front of them, with the idea that when we take collective action, it gives us strength and courage, and there's a power in taking action together. Then as you do this as well, to take a picture of the place where you're holding this prayer service, and then to post it to social media. Explain why you chose this place, how it connects to the ecological crisis. Tag President Biden, Special Envoy Kerry, Secretary Yellen, and tell them that we are #praying for you to take strong action on fossil fuels and debt relief at COP28. So this is our opportunity to say we're walking these two together. So despite the fact that this COP, this is the intergovernmental gathering that's happening in Dubai that I spoke about earlier, is hosted by this, that we need to come forward with a strong and prophetic stance, saying that we're called to still take strong action on fossil fuels. What Laudato Si Movement will then do is we're going to gather all of these pictures that come across with this hashtag, which you can do great internet searches of this, and pull these pictures together, and we're going to create a mural that all of these elected officials who have to walk through the entryway to get to their nice air-conditioned rooms, where they argue over whether they should include a comma in this part of the negotiations. They have to walk past these pictures of seeing images of how the ecological crisis is impacting our Earth right now, right here, the impacts that people are having to live with. So there will be a big mural at this COP made up of these pictures that Catholics and all ecumenical Christians have been taking around the world during the season of creation. The link to this, I know Chris will send out in the email tomorrow, and I can drop it in the chat in just a moment as well, as to how to get all the information and further, like the link to the forgiveness of debt letter and all that sort of a thing. So I invite you to take a deep breath. Again, we look to our faith. Again, we look to say, where am I called to be in this time of crisis, in this time of intensity? And in the Old Testament, there's the book of Esther. And for those of you who know the story of Esther, Esther is this young 13, 14-year-old girl who's called to save her people. And her uncle looks at her as she's debating whether to do this very extreme thing to help save her people. And he says, who knows? Perhaps you were put in this position for a time like this. So while we may be throwing up our hands and saying, I didn't ask for this, I didn't ask to be born into this time where I was born after we had already passed 350 parts per million, which is the safe limit of our emission standards. I didn't ask to be in this space. Perhaps God is reaching out to us and saying, perhaps you were put in a position to be here right now, right here, to lift your voice, to be in this space of and positions of power and positions of decision-making, wherever you are, to make a difference. I'm a strong believer that our faith is an essential part of us being able to move through this crisis with courage, with hope, with a sense of love and compassion towards each other. And so I hope you join us in this call for the season of creation, and in continuing to live out our faith in all the different ways that you can do so, even beyond the season of creation as well.
Thank you, Anna. This is phenomenal. It's very, very, very wonderful and helpful and hopeful. We want to open things up now for any comments or questions. I'd like to ask something quickly, Anna. People talk about technology as being the savior. Well, this isn't that serious. Technology will step in and come up with a magical way, quasi-magical, semi-technological way of solving these problems. What would be the take on that of yours and the Laudato Si movement?
Great question, Paul. Thanks. I just got off a call where we were discussing this, actually. While we have incredible technology that can help us with this, the technology, for instance, around carbon capture is nowhere near where it needs to be. The scientists will all say so, and it's incredibly energy intensive to produce those. So at its heart, and Pope Francis says this too in Laudato Si, the ecological crisis is a spiritual crisis and a social crisis. This is the context that we are in, is that the ecological crisis needs to be responded to with a spiritual solution. There is a beautiful teaching within our faith of like, we look to Jesus, and what did Jesus do for us that was such a powerful model that moved us forward, is practice this act of what eco-theologians call kenosis. I mean, theologians in general call it kenosis. And this idea of self-emptying, of saying that if after living in Uganda, it's the idea of Ubuntu. It's a practice that's very common, or a language that's common in many countries around the world, that I am because we are. That if my ego needs to decrease so that I'm a part of the collective and a part of what we're all together in, then that's what needs to happen. And such a big driver of the climate crisis, and will continue to be even if we develop technology, is this model of consumption and of endless growth. And at what point do we say we are enough? We are enough in relationship with each other and in community, and that's where we really need to be finding our source of strength, and our source of identity is in building this way. So, great question.
Thank you. I see that Christy Taylor has her hand up.
Hi, yeah, and Anna, thank you for the presentation. It's nice to see you a few years after all of our cohorts of the Maryknoll Young Adult Empowerment Groups. So shout out to those groups if anyone knows young people who want to be engaged. I was really moved by the question further up in the chat. I'm going to check to see who had made it. Eliana had made the question about EWTN. And then a few other people have also made the question about parishes that seem to be very slow to embrace the need for ecological justice. And I want to share, I've been working on a lot of studies at the Jesuit School of Theology, and through my program have encountered a lot of inspiration from so many writers and thinkers who are challenging the ideology of Christian nationalism. And when I first heard this, I was like, what's that, and how does that tie everything together? And the more that I delve into it, I see that this is really what's behind a lot of the reluctance in our parishes to engage in ecological movements, because the ideas of Christian nationalism, for anyone who's not familiar, are tying together so many different threads of the desire to dominate others. And we need to, of course, undo that, including undoing the domination of the earth. So I think whatever we can do to be challenging Christian nationalism within our parishes, as well as in larger organizations like EWTN, are really helpful. And a really concrete way for that, does anyone know about the Nuns and Nuns group? Okay, Nuns and Nuns is doing so much work with land justice and hashtag land back. I'll put all this in the chat. Specifically working to rematriate lands to Indigenous stewardship, which, Anna, I loved the image that you showed from New York City, showing that is really the antidote to this, is having lands returned to Indigenous stewardship. So anyhow, those are some thoughts. It's a lot, so I'm going to put in the chat the things I just shared for anyone who wants to look up those things further. So anyhow, thank you for listening. That's my 2 bits.
Thanks, Christy. I will say, and some people think that this will be covered in the next document that Pope Francis is about to release in a couple of weeks. Fun little teaser. So when I did my master's degree program, I did it at a secular university because I wanted to know like what's going on outside of the church world as well. And I didn't tell people I was Catholic for a while when I was in the program. And when it did finally come out, as I was talking to one of my professors, and she goes, well, you know what you need to do then, Anna? I was like, what do I need to do? I don't know. What do I need to do? Tell me. And she goes, you need to deal with the creation story. That is the single most that interpretation is the single most harmful thing that has been done for our work for ecology. She wasn't Catholic. She wasn't Christian. But this idea that if we look back at like the original text and some of the original translation, it had a very dominating translation that was moved throughout the ages. But where it started originally is that we are called to be like stewards of the land. And what does stewarding of the land means? It means that we are in intensive relationship with it. We're not called to dominate, but rather to be in deep relationship with what's moving through the land. And so how do we see ourselves as a part of creation rather than apart from and over creation? So that's such a good point. To the questions about how to move parishes and bigger institutions like EWTN and otherwise. So EWTN actually has invited our Associate Director, Christina Liano, to speak on a number of their programs. And so there are moments where it's being included. I think there's an opportunity with this next year. There's this big gathering on the Eucharistic revival that will happen in 2024 for the U.S. Church. And if we are paying attention to our celebration of Mass with an eye towards creation, it is very immediately clear how creation is tied up in it. And if we talk about Eucharist, fruit of the earth and work of human hands, I mean, fruit of the earth, literally. So thinking about how are we called to be engaging in these conversations, not apologizing for caring for creation, but rather knowing this is an essential part of our faith. And I think the same is true as we talk about parishes, is we all know that, especially in the United States, parish priests are exhausted. They've got so many things on their plate. They're being asked to do all these different parts of it. And so sometimes feels like adding one more thing feels like the straw on the camel's back that they just can't handle. And perhaps they don't understand the urgency of the crisis because they don't have time to dive into the climate science or otherwise. And so some of the most positive and profound ways that I've seen parishes move forward are through the church, which is all of us, showing up and saying, I am part of this church. And so I am interested in helping us have this ecological conversion on our parish grounds, whether that be about rewilding our grounds. There's a movement right now around, anyway, it's the biodiversity commitment has been around. It's called a 30 by 30. So if you've heard of the 30 by 30, there's been a global commitment from everybody who's party to this to have 30% of all lands and waters committed to conservation by the year 2030. Now, the United States is not a part of this agreement. And so there's this movement within the U.S. Church to even say, how can we be a part of this 30 by 30 campaign on church lands? Because the U.S. Church owns a lot of land across the country. Or if it's installing solar panels over your parking lot, or if it's all sorts of other things. When we bring solutions and passion and energy forward, it helps us move. And if you can help root that in our faith, it also helps move as well. So while it might seem at times that parishes are problematic in this, I think it's also just this incredible opportunity. Parishes are a beacon in neighborhoods and in cities of morality to some extent. People pay attention to what banners are hung. People pay attention to what's going on the lands. So how are we modeling that? And how are we using our power to help mobilize and move forward to where we need to be?
Thanks, Anna. And along these lines, just a shout out to the Maryknoll sisters who some years ago donated a portion of their land, of their property for conservation purposes, and developed a wonderful hiking trail along their property in Ossining. So they're modeling that as well, as have a number of other groups also. There's a question here, how do we respond to two things? One, denial of climate change as being caused by civilization and not just natural process. And two, suspicion that climate change is a ploy by quote unquote liberals to take away people's rights to a particular lifestyle.
Chris, you don't give me easy questions. I love it. They're great questions. I mean, I think these are the things, it's the imaging, right, of me sitting down at the Thanksgiving table and someone turning to me and being like, why are you wasting your time at that job? Like, it doesn't make sense. Why are you doing this misinformation campaign? I strongly believe that, having the science helps, having the background and being able to explain the greenhouse gas emissions, to show things like the hockey puck graph that shows like where our greenhouse has been, our parts per million have been for 150 years, and then where it's been in the last, or like forever, and then where it's been in the last 150 years. Just this, they call it the hockey puck graph or a hockey stick graph, because it looks like a hockey stick of where our missions have been. Science helps, but what I have found helps the most is, sounds kind of hokey, but like looking to the witness of Jesus. So what I think Jesus does so brilliantly, and you can see Pope Francis doing it too, is whenever there's a generalized question that people are saying, well, that's not real, or that's not whatever, to bring it to the story, to bring it to the personal. So I can tell the story of Barbara in Uganda, who I was working with on this farm. Or I can tell the story of Annalisa, who I met in Guatemala, who is experiencing this as well in her own way. We can tell the individualized stories. And now, increasingly, we can also tell the stories that we're living here in the United States. After the summer, it's really hard to deny that the climate is changing as people are living through these just extreme heat and other natural disasters. And I would say too, in the second, there's been a lot of beautiful development. Christiana Figueres, who coordinated the 2015 Paris Accords for the UN, she has this really beautiful talk that she did with the Catholic Climate Covenant a couple months ago. And she talks about, can we switch some of the conversation? Like, there's a deep desire to say that we're called towards this life of simplicity and that sort of a thing, which simplicity is attractive to me. However, it's not attractive to everyone. So it's not going to be their driving force. So then we start to say, well, it just makes sense economically if we like batten up our buildings so that we're not having energy leaks and your energy cost goes down. It just makes sense to have, you talk to farmers, any small scale farmers, not the big corporations, but any small scale farmers are saying, no, climate change is changing the way we're doing this. And so what's one solution is regenerative agriculture. And they're seeing how regenerative agriculture means that they can have a harvest every year, whereas before their heavy harvests wiped out. Sort of the shift in conversation to be about the personal experience, and then also to say, it also just makes sense. Like any solution we seek is moving towards greater liberation and greater engagement, and being able to live more fully and wholly.
Thank you, Anna. Great.
Complex questions, politically charged, ideologically charged too, rather than other more noble motivations, right? But here's a comment and a question. I think you've addressed part of it already, but someone wrote, I wish there were a place on my radio dial where I could check in on a regular basis to hear about what technology is doing. I also wonder what we as Catholics could do to build community through networking about our discoveries and needs on how we are relating to the climate crisis. Is there a central spot, perhaps, or a central location that we can, find out what's real and what's not, and what's good science and what's not?
Absolutely. Well, a plug for the Laudato Si movement. I will name, like, the Laudato Si movement is named a movement for a reason. We're called to be a movement of Catholics that are engaging and responding to the ecological crisis. So what does that look like is we have this program called the Laudato Si Animators program that you can go through and kind of learn a little bit more about what's going on, learn our faith, what our faith has to say about it, learn about actions and solutions. And our next one starts on October 7th, which would be great to have you be a part of. Then animators can come together and join a Laudato Si circle, or the Catholic Climate Covenant runs creation care teams, which runs a similar process. This idea of coming together in community to discern what we're called to do and move towards action, and that really helps in moving parishes forward as well. And then all of these are organized under models of chapters where people join together. So Adam, who's on this call, is our fearless chapter leader in the state of Minnesota, thinking about how are we coordinating across the Catholic Church, across the geographical region, like a state or a city, to have Catholics show up. And so this weekend, I don't know if you've heard, there are marches to end fossil fuels happening across the world. In New York City, that's the main march. Our chapter in New York is organizing a Catholic hub where Catholics are coming together before the march kicks off to come together in prayer and discern towards action, to hold a press conference, to try and amplify how we're showing up as Catholics. Our leader in Texas is organizing a rally on the state steps, the steps of the state capitol in Austin around this as well, saying that our faith is impelling and driving us forward into action, and that when we come together in collective power, it's a much bigger space. So I invite you to join the movement. It's a great and exciting thing to be a part of, and we are global. So there's some really cool things too, where like our chapters in East Africa are fighting the East Africa crude oil pipeline. They're putting their lives on the line to protest this pipeline going in. When we've done more research, we've started to see which banks are funding this pipeline. And then all of a sudden, our animators in the UK are protesting these banks, saying, stop funding the East Africa crude oil pipeline. And so because it's a global movement, it's an opportunity to really be connected to global solidarity causes and to say, how am I called as Catholic to be standing in solidarity with my siblings around the world for action and justice?
Very good. Thank you. Interesting. This weekend, it's March. Hopefully it'll be very, very successful. Yeah. Ray has his hand up, Anna. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Anna. Love the presentation and all the work you're doing. I have a question about like the perspective from what you see maybe in climate, around climate justice. I don't hear a lot about the intersection of these other things. I know it's already like a hot issue, but then there's like the intersection of race and, you know, the way that the US has played this key role. I saw this map that showed what will be the habitable area in the world once like you get to these extreme climates, and it's going to be right across the northern hemisphere where the US can be in a relatively safer area. And so the people who caused all this damage are going to be more okay than many others in the global south and other places. But do you see people addressing that part of it, or is it like driven by self-interest that, you know, climate affects me, so I'm going to do something here?
Yeah, this is a great question, Ray. Because race and you know, the power structure holds so much power in this space. There have been some really incredible movements that have been really working to heal relationships with indigenous communities, for example. So in Minnesota, they're doing a ton of work trying to be in closer relationship with the tribes. In Seattle here, for instance, there's been this whole discernment process around what, I saw Patrick was on this call too, around what we can do as Catholics engaging in CareForCreation. And part of that has to do with, we're taking the lead of the tribes around us, around breaching the dams on the lower Snake River and trying to mobilize Catholics to show up for these events, to do these sorts of things. So there's definitely, I mean, this happens in Laudato Si and Querida Amazonia, as well as I think will show up in this next apostolic exhortation of this need to heal our relationships. It's also a social crisis. So heal our very out of whack relationships with power and the historical colonialism and all of those issues, right? And so to think about how are we called to take the lead, to not take the lead, excuse me, but to follow the lead of the communities who are most impacted, to talk about that preferential option for the poor, most impacted, and to say, I'm listening to you and I'm hearing what you're saying. So there was a film that was just released called The Letter Film about a year ago, and it's basically trying to tell the story of Laudato Si as it's lived out in the world right now. It's an 80-minute film. It's free to watch on YouTube. Strongly recommend you just take the time to sit down and watch it. And it points to the fact that in Laudato Si, Pope Francis says we have to listen to 4 voices and take the lead of those 4 voices as we discern our actions. And that's the voice of those who are experiencing poverty, the voice of the youth, the voice of those who are indigenous, and the voice of creation and science itself. So there are definite calls to do that, and there's a lot of work that has to be done in thinking about how do we live out integral ecology.
Thank you.
This is Dave Swing. I'm a member of a group of about 8 missionaries who worked in Africa. We meet each week, and one of the last meetings we had, we discussed the Nairobi Declaration that was just on climate change. It just came out. And so you mentioned Uganda and the pipeline, people whose land that pipeline is going right through in Tanzania aren't too aware of what's happening. So anything we can do to kind of raise this awareness share it with them is useful. But could you comment a bit on carbon offsets? That issue arose in the discussion about the Nairobi meeting, and what foreign companies, investors are proposing through tree plantations in those three countries, Uganda, Tanzania, and I believe Zambia, as a way of, carbon, it's trying to sequester carbon and getting an offset in terms of continuing to burn fossil fuels. Could you say a few things about that would help us understand that better?
Absolutely. And I'm sure you've heard of the book Drawdown. And Drawdown is a really phenomenal book that was written by scientists who diagrammed out the solutions that need to be sought in order to really draw down, is the idea, draw down the carbon out of the atmosphere and get us back into a livable planet. Carbon offsets are a complex issue. At its core, what we need to do is stop consuming as much as we consume. We need to move away from this idea of endless growth, of always needing to have huge returns on investment for investors and stock prices, all those sorts of things. Because as any burgeoning economic response to a crisis, there are people who are out to take advantage of it. And more there have been stories coming up of how people have been taking advantage of carbon offset funds. In addition, there is just the reality that it's hard to measure. Like, people are talking about how you can measure and be like, if you pay this much, it'll offset this flight. It's hard to measure exactly because they're saying we'll plant this many trees, but that means that this many trees, once they fully grow in 50 years, they will take in the carbon from your flight. But that's 50 years down the line, and we have 5, So I think overall what we need more than looking to an economic solution is to think about how we're shifting the way that we live and that we engage in what we're demanding of society. That doesn't mean don't invest in organizations and companies that are doing, a lot of nonprofits that are doing the work of trying to participate in this culture shift that is so necessary. So thinking about how to make sure that your financing is going to the correct place, that where it will do the most good.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the difficulties, is that these tree plantations, most of them never get beyond 5 years. If you were in Uganda, you probably saw trucks driving around with 5-inch poles in them and things like that, which mostly came from tree plantations. It takes, like you say, 50 and up to 100 years for them to really have this full impact. So this is a way of getting around changing our life, as you're saying there. So, plus the people who've lost the land that these plantations come on are out of land. And the traditional trees and plants that were on that land take a lot more carbon out of the air than the trees that come in that are different types. And so I think, that we have to kind of combat this green transit, the hijacking of this green transition by some of these groups that's going on.
Absolutely. You're exactly right on.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. And Anna, I'd just like to point out a couple of hopeful comments in the chat room. One person said, why not begin a petition to ask the USCCB to spend an equal amount of time and money on promoting Laudato Si for the next year? I think that's a good point. We hear about a lot of other concerns from our bishops' conference, but perhaps not enough about the climate and Laudato Si. There's also several comments about youth, young people, youth involvement. We talk about it, but what lines of communication have been developed at this time through schools, especially high schools, to let our youth know that we are mentoring them, not looking to them to solve the problems. I think that's significant as well, because Perhaps, Anna, you could talk a moment about the synod. I know one of the synod issues is this care for creation. That'll be discussed coming up next month. There's also a good comment here about witness, a great need for witness, just to tell others what we are doing. That came from Matt Russo, who has a plot of land in Guatemala where he grows food for those in the area, in the neighborhoods. So Matt said, we can inspire others. We need to inspire others. Tell what we are doing, as little as it might be. So a couple of comments there, and perhaps a question or a theme for discussion.
And I'm happy to stay around. I just wanted to also share this quote from Laudato Si that I think is helpful as we leave some of these challenging conversations that really help us push us, perhaps. As Pope Francis reminds us to go back to that place in creation that gives us that sense of peace and awe and renewal that we talked about in the beginning. He says, anyone who has grown up in the hills or used to sit by the spring to drink or played outdoors in the neighborhood square, going back to these places is a chance to recover something of their true selves. And so, again, happy to stay on for more questions, but I just invite you to find some time today to spend some time outside. You've done an amazing thing by taking time to learn more about what's going on and listening to the science, and spend some time deepening your relationship with creation in one of those places and spaces for you.
I'd also point people back to the chat. There's some wonderful links to some excellent websites that we've talked about or people can visit, opportunities for youth. Christy gave several different two excellent resources to follow. There's information about the march this weekend, a link to that. There's curriculum that Anna had developed when you were working with Maryknoll. One of our workshops, Maryknoll workshops, that's coming up. That's a selfless plug for our Maryknoll work. And Kevin mentioned the Holemakers program, WHOLEMAKERS curriculum that Anna also worked on. And that's for youth, high school and college young people to be involved in this issue. So there's some wonderful resources that we ourselves have and are sharing here. Anna, could you say a word about the synod that's coming up and how Laudato Si may be involved in that?
Yeah, so for those of you who are Catholic nerds like myself and read some of the documents coming out of the synod process, and otherwise, you might have noticed there was a interesting juxtaposition of whether CareForCreation was mentioned or not. And if you pay attention to where it showed up, particularly, it was in the voices of youth, and it was in the voices of those most impacted, particularly in the Asia Pacific region. And so thank goodness that Pope Francis is at the helm and is able to invite and has done such a good job of making bishops and cardinals in less expected places than previously in church structures. And so some of those places, a lot of those places that he has chosen have had extreme ecological impacts happen recently. And he's also invited youth and laity to participate in the synod. So it will be really interesting to see what comes out of it for sure. And then, of course, on October 4th, he's releasing this apostolic exhortation, which he's saying is sort of like an update to Laudato Si, and strongly recommend you read it. It's also very interesting that it's being released on October 4th, which is also the first day of the synod. So it'll be interesting to see how that all shakes out together.
I'd also point out very briefly that we have in the webinar this afternoon another Maryknoller, Joe Thaler, who was very involved recently in our trip to the Native American areas in South Dakota. And Joe is considering a ministry with Maryknoll to our indigenous brothers and sisters in the United States. So I don't know, Joe, if you wanted to say a word about that or not.
I just wanted, just briefly, I guess, I was at Maryknoll, New York recently, and I had an opportunity to present two of the videos, two documentaries. Steve Judd was very much involved in this also. And one of them was
Women of the White Buffalo, and that basically spoke about the women of South Dakota, Lakota Sioux, and very, very good documentary. And then there was another one that is called Dawnland, and that was done up in Maine, and that comes out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that's looking into the whole history of adoption of Native Americans from their home into foster homes. So those are two, if you have a chance to see them, I'd certainly would recommend them. And I want to thank you, Anna. I mean, I really appreciated that. A number of these reservations I visited, they're pretty, and many of them are pretty isolated and pretty dire locations on the land. So I think talking about the environment is so important. And then also, I mean, I spent many years in Nepal in the Himalayas, and I appreciate your comments on, like how do you balance all of this with these emerging huge economies that are coming up, and who believe that they have, that they look at the West and they say, well, you develop by burning fossil fuels, so let us do the same thing. And so it's a big challenge with huge youth populations, and really feeling that something needs to be done. But at the same time, like you mentioned about the sun that is creating more melting of the Himalayan snows because more black rock is exposed. And as that's exposed, the melting is even taking faster. So what we thought was going to be like 100 years from now with the Himalayan snow that's appearing, we're talking maybe, like you say, maybe 5 to 10 years. So it's just a major topic that, we got to continue to look at. Anyway, thanks, Paul.
Thanks so much. That's exactly true. And it's been so inspiring to see some of the solutions that are coming out of the global South, like the idea of microgrid power,
Right.
where, a neighborhood might invest in a solar panel array that they can all use power together, so that, and then if one neighborhood goes down, it's not like the whole city goes down, and that they can be interconnected and send it to each other. There's just a lot that I think about, like the phone system. When I was in Uganda, it was there were no phone wires, but everybody had a cell phone. They just leapfrogged the whole phone infrastructure, the telephone infrastructure that we have in the United States. And so how can we do the same to make real energy sustainability happen and possible?
Thank you, Anna. You've really given us a lot here. At the same time, hope, because this can be such a large and overwhelming issue, and for so many people in so many places that are being so directly impacted. But this movement, the Laudato Si movement, is doing something good, something concrete globally, as are so many other good groups and organizations. So there is hope, there is movement. And as you mentioned, spiritually, we put our trust in our Creator, who gave us this beautiful land and this wonderful universe. So, Anna, could you lead us in perhaps a closing prayer?
For sure. I invite you first to take a deep breath. It's been a full hour and 15 minutes of a lot of information, a lot of every emotion, perhaps, both ends. And as we re-embody ourselves, I invite you to think about how our bodies are made up of creation. We are also part of creation, of water and the same molecules as the earth which surrounds us. We say, dear Creator God, thank you for putting us into this place and time. Help us to continue to feel your warm embrace through the beauty of creation around us, both the individuals who surround us and the communities, as well as all of the stunning creation of trees and flowers and mountains and lakes. Help us to use that support and power to be your hands and feet, your missionary disciples, as we walk forward on this earth, to help build your kingdom and practice true kinship with each other. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Anna, and thank you, everyone. Oh, by the way, on October 11th will be our next webinar. Chris will include that in the follow-up email. Steve Judd is going to lead an excellent webinar on his time in Central South America and the people of that region, the mission in that region. That'll be wonderful also. So October 11th, we'll be sending out invites for that. Thank you. Thanks again, Anna.